Hello and welcome to another Organization Behavior Capsule lecture. Today we're going to talk about organization structure, that is the context in which organization behavior takes place. It's a harder topic than some of them that we've been through so far, in that we don't tend to have implicit theories of structure and systems. Whereas we might have some idea of leadership, we might have some idea of motivation, how to get people to do what we want them to do. No one really has an implicit theory of structure. So we have to rely on, a lot of what our experiences are, a lot of what the authors are trying to tell us. What I would consider the formal study of structure really didn't begin until the 50s. Up until that point in time, we'd done some studies. Remember, we talked about Weber before, his idea of authority structures, the proverbs of administration, these kinds of things. You go from Fayol. We're talking about organization, but we're really talking about management. Whereas what Joan Woodward did in the 50s was to do the first large-scale database studies of organizations. She started classifying and characterizing actual characteristics of organizations, such as the things we still use today. Size was a very important variable for her. The amount of centralization, standardization, the division of labor, this kind of thing. And what Woodward was able to show us was that size itself, had a very strong influence on anything else that was happening within the organization. And that carried on, after that through the Aston Group, and pretty much all the major studies that we're going to talk about today. Problem is that classical organization theorists tended to kind of ignore people in organizations, that somehow these organizations existed without actual workers. Just the same way as in the 40s and 50s, classical organization behaviorists tended to discount the fact people actually worked within organizations. They weren't out there, on a blank field somewhere. So we had to have, humans without organizations is kind of what they were doing. And that doesn't work for us very well either. Because we know that there are many contexts within the organization that affect how people behave. That whole social milieu that we have in the organization depends largely on the structure. And think back again to some of the experiments we've talked about. You look at the Milgram studies, for example, or Zimbardo's prisoner study. We have the overwhelming power of context to influence people's behavior. So we need to really focus in on what the various aspects of the organization structure do to people. Also, it affects the strategy of the organization. Alfred Chandler in 1964 wrote his book Strategy and Structure, which is probably the first modern work on business strategy. And in that, he said that the structure of the organization should follow strategy. That is, once we've determined where the organization needs to go, what is left is to formulate the organization that will help us get there, to structure the systems. When we're talking about organization structure, we're generally talking about stable relationships among groups of positions. We're looking at the big org chart with all those boxes and arrows on it. The CEO at the top and everybody else underneath. Structure is designed, the organization as units, as production processes, what we call the technical systems, and what Tristan Bamforth later called the socio-technical systems. One of the ways that we structure activities is founded on a very basic dynamic that we have in organizations. We have this eternal struggle between differentiation and integration. By differentiation, I mean the basic separation of tasks. We have some people in finance, we have some people in marketing. But yet we have to integrate all this so that they pull together in the same direction. And that dynamic tension between integration and differentiation is what determines everything that we do when it comes to structure and systems. And we'll have structural properties. The Aston Group looked at things like levels, line and staff roles, span of control, that is the number of employees that report to each supervisor, the size of the units, the size of the organization overall, the shape of the organization, which we'll talk about in a bit, and whether or not we have centralized or decentralized authority structures. Structure affects the feelings and emotions, and therefore the behavior of the groups and the people inside them. Attitudes and behaviors are also shaped by peer group pressure. Think back to high school. I mean, you come back to that now and then. All of life is high school. And those structures, had a very strong influence over the way you behaved. The first cleavage point we can make is Burns and Stalker. Talked somewhere around 75, as I recall. Talked about organizations being either mechanistic or organic. By mechanistic, we're talking the standard machine bureaucracy. I mean, what you'd see in Henry Ford's Willow Run plant, where coal and steel go on one side, coal and iron ore go on one side, and finished automobiles go out the other. I mean, this was a completely highly tuned system, and the people were just components of that system. On the other hand, you have organic structures. Think an R&D lab, where people tend to have this interplay, this inner flow of ideas, where they play off each other. Nobody's really in charge, it seems, but you got a whole lot of very bright people getting things done. And our problem is, as Robert Duncan put it, is what we really need is to create an ambidextrous organization, one that can be creative on the one hand, but has enough structure in place on the other to implement our innovations. So, what do we do about that? Well, I'm going to think about how these organization structures actually form. Think back to our first organization. If we're thinking about our small business, the structure is called a basic structure or a simple structure. We've got the boss and everybody else. When an organization starts growing and when it reaches a certain size, it'll start to specialize. It'll functionalize. And that normal separation is over the idea of functions. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a department of marketing, we're going to have a department of finance, we're going to have a department of human resource management, we're going to have a production department, and never the twain shall meet. You will find that most organizations, above a couple of people are actually organized this way, up until you reach a certain size, which we'll get to in a moment. And our advantage of this kind of structure is, of course, the specialization. We have marketing folks talking to marketing folks. We've got our production folks talking to production folks. They tend to specialize in on their tasks. It's highly efficient. Two problems with it. One, communication. It's called stovepiping. If we want to communicate with the folks in another silo, I got to go up, got to go across, and then come back down. That's a real hassle, and it slows communication down. The second one is the idea of management training. I mean, if I'm in charge of the marketing program, it's probably because I'm a pretty damn good marketer. If I'm in charge of production, I'm probably a pretty damn good production engineer. Neither one of these qualifies me to be CEO, because a CEO needs to be a generalist, not a specialist anymore. So that leads to our second problem. But that can be overcome. There's something called the MultiDivisional Form. There's been a lot of writing on it going back to the late 60s, early 70s. And the MultiDivisional Form, the MDF or the M form, what it does is it creates a functional structure and then breaks that apart into various divisions. Think General Motors. They've got Chevrolet, they've got GM trucks, they've got Holden here in Australia, they've got Opel in Europe, and each one of those is a separate division. But each one of those has production and marketing. What they've centralized, though, is decision-making and largely finance. They tend to internalize the financial market. And then the various divisions compete with each other on who gets funding for which projects. And you'll find that almost every large-scale organization in the world has adopted this kind of structure. Why? Because it's pretty much all we have that works. You're going to have to break your organization down in some way. You can't have 500,000 people meeting on some open plain. So in order to make that work, and there's those trade-offs. Those trade-offs are constantly happening here. Our basic principle, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, holds very big here. The more complex the structure, the more administrative overhead we have to facilitate communication. Which leads us to our final organization structure, which is called the Matrix. No, not those silly movies with Keanu Reeves. What we're talking about, the Matrix structure really originated with the Manhattan Project in World War II, where we brought a whole lot of really bright people together and said, you've got this task, you create an atomic bomb, and you can structure it any way you need to. And so they had divisions. We had some folks working on plutonium, some on uranium. We had others that were broad scale looking at triggering mechanisms, and the whole thing fit together like a big matrix. Problem with matrix organizations is twofold. Again, they tend to be twofold, don't they? The first one is that it violates the scalar principle. That is, we no longer have one person reporting to one person. So you've got divided loyalties, divided instructions, divided supervision. When push comes to shove, whose orders do you take? Secondarily, and connected with that, is that in order to overcome the first problem, we've got to have some fairly massive administrative and communication overhead, which makes these organizations rather costly and inefficient. So, that talks about the physical structures, the org charts. But what other parts of structure? Well, how about norms? And I don't mean the guy sitting at the corner of the bar. I'm talking about how we do things around here. It's a great way to talk about norms. The way we do things around here is we do it. Why do we do it? Because we do it. In consulting, I find that's one of my more interesting questions. Why do you do it that way? Well, we've always done it that way, Dwight. Interesting. It means I found my first problem to solve. Norms evolve sometimes, and you have to dig into the origin of them to find out why they're there. But the norms establish conformity, stability, and predictability. They make the place comfortable, and you don't want to deny the importance of having that comfort, because it's both necessary and desirable. But there's the trade-off. When I'm joining an organization, we're going to have make a trade-off here. Solomon Asch attributed people's decision to retain independence or yield to a majority to two main factors: the size of the majority and the identified enduring differences among individuals, particularly character differences in social relations. So we've made that trade-off. We've decided to join the organization. What will influence our behavior now, as I said, is what Tristan Bamforth called socio-technical systems. Interesting $2 word, but what it means. The technical system, how we convert inputs into outputs. It's as simple as that. Workflow technology. We're not talking about computers on people's desks, Twitter, or anything else that comes along with the internet too. We're talking about the most basic technology, how we get the job done. And the social system, well, of course, since the Hawthorne studies, we've known that the social system, the social milieu of the organization, is terribly important. So the interrelation between the social and the technical systems, socio-technical systems, that is going to be the grand influence on our behavior. Okay. As I said, there aren't any very good trade-offs here. Everything has a cost to it. What's our biggest problem with organizations? Well, it's one little French word called bureaucracy. The way that we run bureaus in French. And we've been really paying attention to this, the downsides of bureaucracy. In fact, the dysfunctions of bureaucracy since Robert Merton in the 50s. He said that bureaucracy exerts constant pressures on people to be methodical and disciplined, to conform to patterns of obligations. The problem is these pressures eventually cause people to adhere to rules as an end in themselves rather than just a means to an end, as a matter of blind conformance. The way he phrased that is that instrumental values, that is, the paperwork that we need to do to get our job done, becomes the goal in and of itself. That getting the checklist all filled out properly gets confusing in some organizations, and many organization members feel that that is the true job of the organization, to make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's dotted. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what the problem with that is. That somewhere along the line, the organization has a super goal. That goal is something that we're supposed to be accomplishing. It's the reason for forming the organization. So, if we have that goal, but yet we're paying attention to doing all the stuff in between instead, that goal kind of gets lost. In fact, as the students in my classroom have heard me say, I do firmly believe that when Western civilization collapses, it won't be through some outside influence. It will be that we've killed ourselves with bureaucracy. That somehow that whole structure that we have to live under nowadays of bureaucrats telling us what to do constantly, having us required, filling out paperwork upon paperwork upon paperwork. Eventually, society is going to say, life just isn't worth it anymore, and we'll pick up spears and go into the woods and start hunting. At least that's my 2 cents worth. When it comes to structure, then remember that it can be an overwhelming influence on people's behavior, which is why we can't neglect it as a field of study in organization behavior. By rights, it's organization theory, but we can't miss it here either. In fact, Jeff Pfeffer argued that studies of organizational behavior have overemphasized individual variables and tended to ignore the influence of structural variables. Well, this is an enduring theme. Paul Goodman at Carnegie Mellon back in the 70s looked at some technical systems such as long wall coal mining. And Goodman found that when you took the technology into account, all the OB stuff that we know, the leadership, the motivation, all the theories we have of human behavior, accounted for only 5% of behavior. 95% of it was dictated by the system used to pull the coal out of the ground. So I think Pfeffer's got a point there that we should make. And he says a concern with structural effects can enrich analysis of even individual outcomes such as satisfaction, performance, and salary. A final topic in talking about people's relationship to organizations that have psychological contracts. Psychological contracts are the unwritten sets of expectations between all members of the organization, the various supervisors, managers, and others. That is, I join an organization, I've made a deal with them. You will do this for me, I will do this for you. Whether or not that's in the employment contract, generally it says, if you treat me fairly, I will treat you fairly. Very simple kind of relationship. Yes, there are other parts to that. In academia, we used to believe in something called tenure, which is once I got the job, I can't be fired. No longer true. Nearly true, but no longer true. But the idea is that as long as I'm performing my job, you got to leave me the hell alone. And as long as you leave me alone, I'm going to keep doing my job. The problem is that now and then we have to violate that contract. And if the organization does it without a good explanation, that erodes trust. And once that trust is, or if I do it, if I stop showing up to work, the organization's got a problem. I have violated their trust. If I miss deadlines consistently, I'm violating their trust. So therefore, that contract has been violated. And when the contract is violated, the reactions tend to be overwhelmingly negative. That the easy one is that if I feel that the organization has violated my trust, I'll withdraw my behavior, my efforts. I'll sit in my office. I won't talk to anybody. I'll do the absolute minimum, what the British train drivers used to call working the book. They worked to the rule book, and the trains never got anywhere on time. In fact, some of them never got there at all. And if the organization feels that I violated their trust, they're going to sideline me. They're going to put me in an office in the middle of nowhere and just kind of ignore me. They won't ask for my opinion. They won't count me in on committees of various sorts, and I'll never be considered for promotion. None of these are good. So we need to consider the importance of that psychological contract, and the fact is, for better or worse, it's there, and it's just something we need to recognize. So, I think that explains everything we need to about organization structure today. Hope you've had a good one, and I'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.